Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Come and join my Patreon where you'll get episodes earlier, bonuses, have a say in future content, and come join my group chat. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello Warbirders. Firstly, if you're listening to this on YouTube, it's audio only and comes straight from my podcast feed. I do have YouTube videos with images, but this one isn't. I want to welcome new Patreon supporters Lawrence Tierney and Richard Goldblatt on board the team. I also want to thank Dale Longmire, Felix Saint-Jean, and John Hall for being with me on Patreon since 2023. Seems unfair that only the newbies get the shout-outs, right? But thank you so much. Boy, am I a sucker for punishment. Just coming off another sprawling epic warbird with multi-parts, the Ju-88, and what do? I jump into another one that has an even longer history and possibly even future. Yes, you heard that correctly, future. So let's dive in without too much preamble. So if you grabbed a random warbirder and demanded that they tell you what warbirds were built by Consolidated, do you think they would say the PBY first? I don't think so. The answer you'd probably get is the B-24 Liberator, right? Well, they did build thousands of them. But what Consolidated was known for prior to that was flying boats. In fact, there was a tongue-in-cheek joke amongst B-24 aircrews that the Liberator had been designed as a flying boat. I mean, look at the shape of it. But that it had leaked so badly that they had made a bomber out of it instead. So, when the United States Navy requested competing prototype designs for a flying boat in 1933, Consolidated wanted to be in the running. They already had experience with building two previous flying boats for the Navy. The new one needed to have a range of 3,000 miles at a cruising speed of 100 miles per hour. Isaac M. Ladden, Consolidated's chief engineer since 1927, was given the job. Now, you may have not heard of him, but not only was he the driving force behind the PBY, but he also designed the Liberator, and later on the B-36 Peacemaker, and the civilian Convair airliners. He also had worked on the two previously mentioned Consolidated flying boats for the Navy. The first, the XPY-1 Admiral, was a big parasol monoplane and actually was the Navy's first large monoplane flying boat. It made its first flight from Anacostia Naval Air Station in Washington, D.C. in early 1929. Even though successful, the U.S. Navy opened the offer up to other bidders. The Glenn Martin Company came along and undercut Consolidated with their cheaper design, which was supposedly heavily influenced, wink wink, by Consolidated's, and they got the contract instead. Now, Consolidated could have yelled no fair, but they just rolled up their sleeves and started on the next one, so they were ready when the Navy placed a new contract on the 26th of May 1931 for an improved flying boat. Consolidated offered its Model 22 Ranger. This one had updated features such as an enclosed cockpit. Nice, less windy. It actually looks a bit like the Japanese Mavis, if you remember that episode. Okay, time to increase our vocabulary warbirders. Because I've been obsessing over these planes for my whole life, and I don't think I've ever run into this word. The Ranger was a sesquiplane. What the heck is that? Okay, so you know biplane, right? 2 wings. Triplane, 3. We mainly deal with monoplanes in our era, which means 1 wing. Actually, as a kid, this term really confused me, thinking that it meant like only 1 wing on one side. But a sesquiplane is a type of biplane where 1 wing is significantly smaller than the other. Sesquiplane is actually Latin for 1.5 wings. So, fittingly, the lower wing, usually, has no more than half the surface area or span of the upper wing, offering a compromise between the low drag of a monoplane and the structural strength of a biplane. Now you know. So the Ranger had a parasol, sesquiplane wing with the smaller lower wing mounted to the top of the hull. Two Wright R1820 Cyclone engines were located on the undersides of the top wing, and initially it had a third engine mounted on struts above the wing. But that was removed after the first test in April 1932. I'm not sure why, because almost never has any Warbird said, too much power, no thanks. But anyway, the Navy liked it, called it the XP2Y1, and ordered 23 of them. And a total of 78 were built. Argentina, Colombia, and Japan operated them also. There's pics of these on Patreon. So, in 1933, when the United States Navy requested competing prototype designs for still another, newer flying boat, Consolidated and Ladin were ready. What they called the Model 28 again had a parasol wing, and this time was a monoplane with external bracing struts mounted on a pylon over the fuselage. Lots of attention was spent on cleaning up drag. Earlier flying boats from many companies were a tangle of wires and struts. The Model 28 was much more slippery. Even the stabilizing floats out on the wings were retractable in flight to form streamlined wingtips. This was a technology that had been licensed from the Saunders Roe Company in the UK. The fuselage hull design looks very similar to the earlier P2Y, but the Model 28 had a much cleaner single tail unit instead of a cluttered, strut-braced twin tail. The 28 was all metal with aluminum stress skin, except for fabric-covered control surfaces. Power was provided by two 825 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radials up on the wing's leading edges. Defense was provided by four 30 caliber Browning machine guns, and offense was to be 2,000 pounds of bombs. The prototype had its maiden flight on the 21st of March 1935. The Navy liked it and called it the XP3Y1. But they had requests in order to make the ship into what they called a patrol bomber. So when the updates were completed, the plane got a new designation from the Navy, PBY1. PB for patrol bomber and Y for Consolidated Aircraft as the manufacturer. Why? Well, in 1922, the U.S. Navy had started giving single-letter codes to manufacturers. C went to one of the oldest suppliers, Curtiss. So when Johnny-come-lately Consolidated came along, C was already taken. So it got an open letter at the end of the alphabet. Will you allow me a brief diversion that has nothing to do with the PBY? Because I just learned this, and I don't know where else to put it, as we've already looked at all the Grumman cats. How the heck did Grumman end up with F? Well, when the manufacturing codes were being handed out, G had already been issued to the Great Lakes Aircraft Company. But, funnily enough, F was now open. How? Well, it had originally been given to Fokker, but by 1933, Fokker's American branch had rebranded itself into the Atlantic Aircraft Corporation, and they got another code. No, it wasn't A, and I'm not going to get into it because we're already miles off track here. If I ever do the Brewster Buffalo, it'll come up then. But Grumman got the F, and thank God, because then we get the fantastically memorable F, insert number, F, series of U.S. Navy fighters. All right, let's get back on track. So this time Consolidated was competing against Douglas with their XP3D. Douglas's offering was a shoulder-winged flying boat with twin engines mounted high in the wings. fixed wing floats, and also a single tail. It looks a bit chonky compared to the 28, but supposedly had comparable performance. So what was the difference that decided the contract? Yup, price. Douglas's offer cost $110,000, while Consolidated was a bargain at $90,000. The XPBY-1 first flew on the 19th of May 1936, making a record non-stop distance flight of 3,443 miles. Production started immediately on the initial order of 60. The second production order was placed on the 25th of July 1936. VP-11F got their first XPBY-1 in October 1936. VP-12 started receiving theirs in early 1937. From that point on, it was a story of constants. Constant improvement and refinement. Constant demand for more PBYs within the U.S. services and then from elsewhere. Constant expansion of production to try to keep up with the demand. These factors all make going over all the different variants almost impossible, as they were made in different countries to go to different services and with different names. It's almost as bad as the DC-3 series, if you remember that one. So I'm going to gloss over some, so the rivet counters may have to grit their teeth a tad. PBY-1 was the first order, with 60 built, using 900 horsepower Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. The PBY-2 had updates such as the redesign of the tail control surfaces to reduce stiffness and thus pilot fatigue on those long patrols. Also, salt water had been getting into and corroding the cables for the bomb release mechanisms, so they were redesigned. The PBY-2 also got new heavy-duty underwing bomb racks capable of carrying a wider variety of ordnance, including the Navy's newer experimental deep water depth charges and torpedo shackles. The radio operator station was modernized with newer, more reliable long-range radio equipment, which required relocating some storage lockers inside the main fuselage cabin. Later adjustments were made to the pilot's cockpit instrumentation layout, standardizing the instrument panel to match the Navy's updated blind flying IFR requirements of 1937. 50 of those were built. The PBY-3 got an engine upgrade with 1,000 horsepower engines, and 66 of those were built. The PBY-4 got another power bump with 1,050 horsepower engines, and 33 were built. Well, up until now you may be saying, "What's so confusing, Brian? This is pretty straightforward." Well, welcome to the PBY-5. 683 of them were built by Consolidated in San Diego, California, and New Orleans, Louisiana. They had another boost in power with 1,200 horsepower engines and extra self-sealing fuel tanks. Some of these went to the RAF, where they like word names for their aircraft. For flying boats and maritime patrol bombers, the convention was to name them after coastal port towns or islands, like Sunderland. Supposedly, when Great Britain ordered its first batch of the aircraft from Consolidated Aircraft, Reuben Fleet, the president of Consolidated, suggested the name Catalina because of the famous resort island located right off the coast of Southern California, not very far from Consolidated's primary manufacturing plant in San Diego. The name fit perfectly. It fit the RAF's requirement for an island port name and honored the aircraft's Californian origins, and the RAF officially adopted it in late 1940. The name became so popular and recognizable that even American services started using the name also. In November 1939, one PBY-4 had been pulled off the line and converted into an amphibian, meaning that it had retractable wheels as well as the ability to operate on water. Until now, the PBY had been a pure flying boat. and it required beaching gear to be added to allow it to taxi up a ramp and onto land. There is even a theory that there was a conflict between the designer, Ladin, and Fleet about the amphib version. Fleet wanted one, and Ladin wanted to keep it simple, with just the flying boat version without landing gear. Supposedly Fleet said, "Fine, don't put in landing gear, put in internal beaching gear," so that they could operate independently without the need for a beaching crew. This amphib experiment was called the XPBY-5A, and when the test proved successful, they called the resulting production model the PBY-5A. The Soviet Union was desperate for flying boats, and so they purchased a contract to build their own. Of course, just like the Soviet-built DC-3s, all the documentation had to be translated into Russian, and all the measurements had to be converted into metric. They were powered by Shetsov Ash-62s, which themselves were license-built variants of the Wright Cyclone R-1820. The Soviet PBY-5 was called the GST, which stands for... Eva, could you help me out with this?
Of course. Гидросамолет транспортный.
Thanks. Okay, so while we're talking about PBYs made in other countries, we should cover the Canadian ones, right? I had always known that Canadian Vickers had built some, but just in doing this research, I discovered that Boeing Canada built 240 PBY-5 flying boats, no wheels, for the RAF and RCAF from 1942, and 55 PBY-5A amphibious aircraft for the RCAF. They were officially designated PB-2Bs, so if you ever see that, it's not a typo. They also made 67 units with a taller fin, and these were sent to the RAF as the Catalina 6. Okay, so the one I knew about was the Canadian Vickers version, which was an amphib. They were built about 10 miles away from where I am presently sitting in a part of Montreal known as Cartierville. 380 were built there, and 150 went to the RCAF, where they were called the Canso, which is a Canadian coastal town in Nova Scotia. So it works with the whole RAF naming scheme. There's an old joke about the name, though. It goes like this. When RCAF pilots first saw a PBY, they said, "This thing can't fly." And the engineers answered, "It can so." Can so. Get it? It's not that funny. Some went to the US AAF, and they called them the OA-10A. I'm never going to remember that, so I don't even know why I brought it up. Okay, one last manufacturer. Did you know that the US Navy had its own aircraft factory at one time? Yup. It had the rather unimaginative name of Naval Aircraft Factory, or NAF, and it was located in Philadelphia. While other manufacturers like Boeing Canada and Canadian Vickers and the Soviets built exact license copies of Consolidated's blueprints, the Naval Aircraft Factory decided to do an overhaul of the Catalina design. So, what did they do? The NAF engineers made major structural alterations to the hull and tail. The hull was extended forward by 2 feet and given a much sharper clipper-style bow, dramatically improving handling during rough sea takeoffs and landings, preventing the nose from digging into waves. The vertical stabilizer and rudder were made significantly taller and given a squared-off shape to cure a long-standing Catalina issue, which was poor directional stability and heavy rudder control forces during the high-load flights. The wing structure was packed with extra fuel bladders, allowing it to carry 1/3 more fuel than a standard PBY-5, pushing the maximum endurance to over 20 to 30 hours of continuous flight. making it a spectacular long-range scout and making its eventual name, the PBN-1 Nomad, pretty fitting. It was not an amphib, by the way. Despite being designed by the U.S. Navy's own factory, the U.S. Navy barely used them. By the time the Nomad was rolling off the line in large numbers in 1944, the U.S. Navy was already pivoting heavily towards the twin-engined Martin PBM Mariner and another consolidated product, the four-engined PB4Y2 Privateer for frontline operations. Instead, out of the 156 Nomads built by the NAF, 137 of them were shipped directly to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease policy. The Soviet Navy loved them. They used their staggering 20 to 30-hour range to hunt German U-boats in the Arctic and conduct massive open-sea rescue operations in the Black Sea and Northern fleets, keeping them in active service well into the 1950s. Are you enjoying this show? Please help support it at World of Warbird's Patreon. It's only $5 a month. You get the episodes a week earlier and bonuses. You have say on future content and able to interact with me directly through our group chat. If you're presently listening to this through Patreon, well, thank you for your support. Also, you can give me a review or share me with a friend. It all helps and I appreciate it more than you know. Let's get back into it. Okay, so specifically, what is it like inside a Catalina? Now, I've been outside a couple in person, the most surprising one being the Ghost of Gananoque. I was at Gananoque, Ontario doing a parachuting course, and there it was in the hangar collecting dust. Holy crap, that's a Catalina! I didn't know about the Canso then. So I've never been inside one, and I'll have to rely on the observations of others. Although I did find a PDF of the POH, the Pilot Operating Handbook, from 1940. There's always lots of fun details in the POH. For example, the following maneuvers are prohibited in the Catalina: loops, rolls, chandelles, Immelman turns, inverted flight, and spins. Although I don't know who would try. Also, the pre-flight check includes check supply of chemical toilet bags and toilet paper. Well, I mean, you're going to be airborne for maybe 20 hours, right? So the following walkthrough is a representative one. An aircraft with this many variants from so many companies in so many countries over such a long period of time are bound to have a lot of differences. But stepping inside a PBY Catalina is less like entering a modern airplane and more like boarding a small, zinc chromate painted submarine. Because it was designed both as a seafaring vessel and an aircraft, the interior is divided by heavy, watertight bulkheads with oval, rubber-sealed hatches that the crew had to step through in order to move between compartments. Starting at the very front in the nose, you are standing in a cramped, multi-purpose space right below the bow gunner's turret, which mounts two 30 cal guns. Below the nose turret platform is a small sealed optical window in the keel hull. During a bombing run, the bombardier would lie prone on the floor here to use the Norden bomb sight. Yes, I was surprised that it had a Norden installed too. But remember, it was conceived as a patrol bomber, right? This area houses the heavy marine anchor, mooring lines, a boat hook, and a bilge pump interface. When docking on water, a crewman had to stand right here to handle lines through a top hatch. Stepping aft through the first bulkhead, you climb slightly onto the flight deck floor. The pilot sits on the left and the co-pilot on the right, as per the usual. Between them is a control pedestal. Many of the Catalina's controls, like throttles, prop control, cowl flap controls, and trim wheels, are mounted directly on the ceiling, requiring the pilots to reach upward to adjust them. Moving backward through the next oval hatch brings you beneath the massive overhead wing pylon. Here sits the navigator on the left with a flat wooden charting table with drawers for maps. a drift meter built into the floor, and a mounting bracket for a marine chronometer. The radio operator is on the right, facing a wall of vacuum tube radios, tuning coils, and a telegraph key for Morse code. Later World War II variants also packed a crude radar scope display into the station. I was surprised to learn that the flight engineer was located in his tower in the pylon. You know, the thing supporting the parasol wing. It is directly above the radio room, where the interior opens up into a vertical shaft extending straight up into the hollow aluminum pylon structure that holds the wing. The flight engineer sat up inside this pylon during flight, surrounded by mechanical fuel selectors, oil temperature indicators, and throttle linkages. He even had small windows looking out directly at the backs of both running Pratt & Whitney engines to monitor for leaks or smoke. Now isn't that handy? Step through the next bulkhead and you enter the widest part of the hull, directly behind the wings. Because the PBY patrols easily lasted 15 to 20 hours, this was the crew's rest area. There are 2 folding metal-framed canvas bunks chained to the hull walls, allowing off-duty crew members to sleep in shifts. There's a hot plate and food storage lockers for heating up soup, coffee, or other rations during grueling North Atlantic or Pacific sweeps. Yes, of course, tea too. Further aft again are the waist gun blisters with the large bulging plexiglass side blisters with the 50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted on swiveling mechanical yokes. The floor here slopes upward dramatically towards the tail. Standing between the open or translucent blisters offers a panoramic view of the sky and the water below. This area was incredibly noisy, windy, and freezing cold during high-altitude winter flights. From the POH, I've learned that the blisters were made watertight by an inflatable seal. Going aft again through the final structural bulkhead brings you into the narrowing tail cone, an uninsulated skeletal space of exposed aluminum ribs. Cut into the bottom floor of the hull is a small, downward-facing trapdoor. A crewman could lie prone here to fire a single light machine gun downward to defend the plane's blind spot beneath the tail. This was called the tunnel gun. Looking past the tunnel hatch into the rear of the cone, you can see the bare mechanical cables and push rods running along the ceiling to operate the tail's rudder and elevator surfaces. And here is where we end our tour. I've been recently watching the new Tom Hanks narrated World War II documentary, and I've noticed 2 things. 1, they left out the Doolittle raid? Come on, guys. And secondly, PBYs were everywhere. So, let's now begin to see what the USA and her allies did with their PBYs. In 1940, the RAF had purchased 200 PBYs for Coastal Command, clearly appreciating the aircraft's staggering 20-plus hours endurance. Now, normally, if I'm going to talk about pilots, I do it later in the show. But it makes sense to talk about Leonard B. Tuck Smith now because it shows the introduction of the PBY to the RAF, the uneasy but growing cooperation between the 2 allies, and how the PBYs, actually, let's call them Catalinas as the RAF did, would make history. Missouri native Tuck Smith was awakened at 3 a.m. on the 28th of March 1941 during what seems to have been quite a cushy duty. His country was at peace, and he was stationed aboard a seaplane tender in beautiful Acapulco Bay, Mexico. He had earned his wings 2 years before. Anyway, on that early March morning in 1941, he was notified that he had been volunteered to help ferry the new Mark I Catalinas to England and check out the RAF's Coastal Command pilots in their use. Oh yeah, he also couldn't tell anybody. Although the United States was officially neutral, President Roosevelt had already decided to aid the British in their war with Germany. One form of help was 200 Lend-Lease Catalinas for convoy escort duty. The sale of the Catalinas was public knowledge. U.S. Navy pilot help was not. To maintain the appearance of neutrality and to protect the president from the America First isolationist types, Smith and other U.S. Navy pilots would have to maintain utmost secrecy. Posted to 209 Squadron in Lough Erne, North Ireland, Tuck and his fellow U.S. Navy pilots were not just checking out the RAF pilots on their new aircraft, they were going along, unofficially of course, on actual missions. Just a reminder again, the USA at this point was still neutral. Only a couple of months into this unofficial duty in May, the German battleship Bismarck had sallied forth into the North Atlantic and sunk the pride of the Royal Navy, the battleship HMS Hood. Prime Minister Winston Churchill responded by ordering an all-out effort to sink the Bismarck. The only problem was, Bismarck had disappeared. At the early morning briefing on May 26, 1941, Smith was caught up in this all-out effort when the squadron to which he was attached was, of course, assigned a mission that day to find the Bismarck. His Catalina was already loaded for anti-submarine duty with 4 depth charges. But the rush was so great that they were to take off immediately, leaving the depth charges under the wings. The weather was truly foul, with ceilings as low as 100 feet, when at 3:25 a.m., Smith's Catalina, number AH-545, lifted off from the waters of Lough Erne and, along with the rest of the squadron, headed west in search of the Bismarck. Officially, RAF pilot Officer Dennis Briggs was the pilot and Smith was the co-pilot. The distances involved in this search were truly staggering. It took 6 hours for them just to reach their assigned search sector. But it seems like they've been given a plum location because not too long after that, at 10:10, they saw something. Here's what happened in Tuck's own words. I sighted what was first believed to be the Bismarck. I immediately took control from George, that's the autopilot, started a slow climbing turn to starboard, keeping the ship sighted to port, while the British officer went aft to prepare the contact report. My plan was to take cover in the clouds, get as close to the ship as possible, making definite recognition, and then shadow the ship from the best point of vantage. Upon reaching 2,000 feet, we broke out of a cloud formation and were met by a terrific anti-aircraft barrage from our starboard sector. Getting violently shook up by anti-aircraft bursts that damaged the Catalina, Tuck dumped the depth charges and performed violent evasive action as additional contact information, including confirmation that the ship was the Bismarck, was transmitted. Tuck and the crew later lost contact with the battleship, but their contact messages had been sent, and more importantly, received. Everything that the British had converged on an intercept course with the Kriegsmarine's monster battleship. Tuck's Catalina landed 18 hours after taking off. The next morning, the Bismarck was at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The U.S. Navy awarded Smith the Distinguished Flying Cross for finding the Bismarck, although it was years before he could tell anybody why. December 7, 1941 was a sad day for the PBYs of Pearl Harbor. Almost 80 of them, many of them brand new, were destroyed on the ground at Kaneohe, NAS, and Ford Island. Sorry if I got the pronunciation of that one wrong. Only 4 flyable Catalinas survived, 3 of them because they had been luckily in the air at the time of the attack. But the PBYs continued to make history when one of them became the first aircraft to strike back at the Japanese. I say strike back, but it actually bombed a Japanese midget submarine that definitely shouldn't have been there an hour before the main assault on Pearl. History again was made when a Catalina scored the first U.S. Navy's credited air-to-air kill of a Japanese airplane in the Pacific War. Yup, the pokey PBY. On the 10th of December 1941, when the Japanese attacked the Cavite Navy Yard in the Philippines. While flying to escape during the raid, Lieutenant Harmon T. Utters, PBY, was pounced on by 3 Japanese Mitsubishi A6M-2 fighters. Chief Boatswain Earl D. Payne was in the bow operating the nose turret and shot one down, thus scoring the U.S. Navy's first kill. Way to go, Catalina! But it was not all successes. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Patrol Wing 10, Pat Wing 10, had been waging a desperate fighting retreat from the Philippines. Greatly outnumbered, the wing had already lost the vast majority of its 43 aircraft to Japanese strafing raids. On Christmas Day 1941, Japanese forces landed on Jolo Island in the southern Philippines to establish an advanced fighter base. Desperate to hit back and slow down the Japanese advance toward the Dutch East Indies, the U.S. Asiatic Fleet ordered a daylight bombing counterattack against Japanese shipping in Jolo Harbor. On the morning of December 27, 6 PBY-4 Catalinas from Patrol Squadron 101, VP 101, led by Lieutenant Burden R. Hastings, took off from Ambon in the Dutch East Indies. The odds were not in their favor. This slow-speed raid in broad daylight against a heavily defended enemy anchorage was tantamount to a suicide run. To make matters worse, the PBYs had 0 Allied fighter escort. They were entirely on their own. The Catalinas arrived over Jolo Harbor at roughly 10,000 feet, and their formation was immediately broken up by AA fire. They did their best to drop their bombs on Japanese transports. However, before they could turn back, they were jumped by a swarm of Japanese Mitsubishi A6M-0s and Nakajima A6M-2N Rufi floatplane fighters operating from the newly captured base and nearby warships. The ensuing air battle was a slaughter. 4 out of the 6 PBYs were shot down in rapid succession over the harbor or during the immediate retreat. Only 2 of the 6 Catalinas managed to limp away from Jolo. One of the surviving planes, piloted by Lieutenant Duncan A. Campbell, performed a daring open ocean rescue the next day, landing in treacherous waters near Jolo to pluck the surviving crew of a downed sister PBY out of the sea before the Japanese could capture them. For this action, Campbell was later awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The human cost was devastating. Numerous naval aviators, including flight leader Lieutenant Hastings and crewman Joseph Bangust, were killed. In a testament to the sacrifice of the air crews that day, the U.S. Navy later named 7 destroyer escorts in honor of the PBY aviators who fought and died in the skies over Jolo. Could this story get even more tragic? Yes, actually it did. Lieutenant Hastings and his men were the only aircrew captured by the Japanese. They were interrogated by their captors and then beheaded on the parade ground of the Jolo garrison. In the post-action report from one of the surviving pilots, he wrote, open quotes, "It is impossible to outrun fighters with a PBY-4. Under no circumstances should PBYs be allowed to come in contact with enemy fighters unless protected by fighter escort." Close quotes. But what they couldn't do escorted in the day, painted black, they could do at night. In a tactical pivot in late 1942, the PBY would be turned into a terrifying nocturnal stealth hunter. To do this, standard PBY-5s and amphibian PBY-5A Catalinas were stripped of their bright schemes and slathered from nose to tail in flat, non-reflective, matte black paint and equipped with state-of-the-art radar. Operating primarily out of the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and New Guinea, the Black Cats ruled the Pacific Night from December 1942 through 1944. Their primary mission was to disrupt the Tokyo Express, the fast Japanese destroyers and supply barges sneaking troops down to frontline islands under the cover of darkness. Their procedure was standard setting for early electronic warfare. Flying low over the water to avoid detection, the Black Cat crews used their air-to-surface vessel, ASLV, radar to spot Japanese shipping up to 20 miles away in pitch-black conditions. Once a target was acquired, the pilots cut the throttles back to idle glide. The black paint made them completely invisible to the eye, and the low engine rumble was masked by the ambient noise of ocean surf. They would glide in at terrifyingly low altitudes, sometimes just 50 to 100 feet off the water, and drop their bombs or torpedoes right into the sides of Japanese vessels before the enemy even realized that an aircraft was overhead. The Black Cats didn't just sink ships, they terrorized Japanese bases. Because a single PBY could stay airborne for 15 to 20 hours, a small rotation of Black Cats could fly overlapping orbits above a Japanese airfield all night long. For example, they would drop a single bomb every half hour, throw out empty beer bottles, which supposedly made a terrifying bomb-like whistling scream as they fell, or randomly fire their .50 caliber waist guns into searchlights. This denied the Japanese garrison sleep and rattled enemy morale while incurring very few American losses. It was bed check Charlie, Catalina style. Because they were already operating in the dark where enemy fighters couldn't see them, Black Cat crews frequently doubled as open ocean rescue platforms. If a B-24 Liberator or Navy fighter went down at sea during a daytime strike, a Black Cat would track the survival rafts by radar at night, touch down blindly in pitch black, rough ocean swells, pack the survivors into the galley compartment, and claw its way back into the skies. By the peak of the campaign in 1944, there were roughly 14 different patrol squadrons, operating as designated Black Cat units. They accounted for hundreds of thousands of tons of destroyed Japanese shipping and severely choked the enemy supply lines in the South Pacific. So that's about the halfway mark of the story. So there's a lot more PBY, Catalina, or Canso material coming as we wrap up the war, then look at post-war, the present, and yes, the future of the Catalina. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters. You guys keep me getting up at 5 a.m. to make this show. You can check out the photos of what we've been talking about on Patreon. It's available to all. Why don't you join Patreon? There's a free option. And if you can't, well, why not just leave me a good review? Until next time.